Welcome back to Lesson 10-2. This is part 2 of our series on conservatives reshaping politics. In this lesson, we're going to focus heavily on the first term of President George W. Bush. But first, to recap, in the 1980s and 1990s, conservatives guided the actions of government. This was true even when a moderate Democrat, Bill Clinton, was president of the United States because of conservative control in Congress. Reagan and Bush took tough stances on foreign policy and oversaw the successful conclusion of the Cold War, while the conservative Congress helped to really shape domestic policy during the Clinton years. Therefore, leaning on 2 decades of conservative victories in politics, we went into the 2000 presidential campaign. In this year, Vice President Al Gore, who was more of a progressive than Clinton was, went up against Texas Governor George W. Bush, a real conservative in America. Now, there were others who also ran, notably Ralph Nader of the Green Party and Pat Buchanan of the Reform Party. And I mention them because both of them, while they didn't come anywhere close to competing against the two main candidates, did get a large number of votes that turned into a small percentage of the overall. Now, the contest between Bush and Gore was close. It was the closest in modern history, so close, in fact, that those other parties did help to impact the election results. Now, when all the votes were tallied, Al Gore held a 300,000 vote lead, 300,000 more votes than George W. Bush. But because of how our election system in America works and the rules of the Electoral College, the electoral votes are all that matter. And at the end of the day, Al Gore held a 20-vote lead in the Electoral College, but the state of Florida had not yet certified the results of their election, and the winner of Florida would get 25 votes. So either Gore would win by 45 or Bush would win by 5, depending on the results in Florida. Now, the Florida Election Commission does end up giving George W. Bush the state of Florida by just a few hundred votes. But problems arose over how the names were displayed on the ballots. And many ballot machines had not worked properly. There were a number of irregularities within the state of Florida. And because of these irregularities, Al Gore requested a hand recount of all of the ballots in 4 counties to check and make sure that voter intentions were clear. Now, George W. Bush will sue to stop the recount, to not allow the recount in the state of Florida. This case will wind up being moved to the United States Supreme Court. The court at the time had a 5-4 conservative majority and voted 5-4 along party lines to stop the recount of Florida. When the recount stopped, the time elapsed on when a recount was legally allowed, and the presidency of the United States went to George W. Bush. Now, this experience in 2000 meant that many voters became distrustful of the electoral system in our country. Many feared that a similar result, where one politician wins a majority, a clear majority, but loses the election, could happen again. And of course, in 2016, just 16 years later, Hillary Clinton will have 3 million more votes than her opponent, but lose that election again because of the Electoral College. But now President Bush is president, and attention is quickly drawn away from the election and election reform when on September 11th, 2001, the U.S. was hit by a terrorist attack, a very large and significant one. On that day, over 3,000 Americans were killed, and the World Trade Center in New York City was destroyed. Now, on October of 2001, President Bush signed a law that allowed the government to hunt for terrorists within the United States. This was the Patriot Act. In addition to this, the Department of Homeland Security is created in order to coordinate American efforts against terrorism. And then we went on a hunt for Al Qaeda, the terrorist organization which had flown 2 airplanes into 2 of America's largest buildings in New York City. This hunt for Al Qaeda leads us into the war in Afghanistan. Al Qaeda was led by this man right here, Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden had been the individual most responsible for planning those attacks. Now, since Al Qaeda was in Afghanistan, the United States went to the Afghan government and demanded that Osama bin Laden be handed over. The Taliban, which was a group in charge of Afghanistan at the time, refused to help the United States, refused to hand them over, and in return, the United States declared war on the Taliban and invaded Afghanistan. With the Taliban then knocked out of power, and years later, bin Laden was killed, but both do still continue to fight the United States today. Both Al Qaeda, in a very weakened form, and the Taliban, which may yet regain control over Afghanistan. That war continues. In 2003, George W. Bush led us into a second war, so we would be fighting 2 wars at the same time, this time against Iraq. We feared the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, might be creating weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and that if he had created these, he might hand them over to terrorist groups to help them out. Now, this is a lot of ifs and mights to base a war off of, but we did that back in 2003. And within 1 month of the invasion, U.S. and British forces, the British helped us out, defeated the Iraqi army. But fighting continued for over 7 years before the nation was fully under control. And once it was, we learned that Iraq never had created WMDs. And furthermore, we learned that Saddam Hussein had little to no connections with any terrorist organizations. The entire basis for this war was incorrect. So now let's look at the economic issues and the issues of the Bush presidency at home. At home, George W. Bush continued the Ronald Reagan policies of deregulation and increased accountability for state governments, shifting the power of government from the federal government to the states. One policy that gained a lot of support was a policy called No Child Left Behind, a major education reform. This policy was responsible for trying to increase student test scores on standardized testing. Unfortunately, it did fail, and American test scores compared to other nations fell during the period that this policy was in place. We also had economic troubles. Under deregulation, businesses were allowed to grow and grow rapidly, and sometimes irresponsibly. See, without government oversight, businesses could act any way they wanted. And kind of like a toddler in a candy store, they went wild and did things that were not, in hindsight, the smartest decisions. In some cases, that led to the complete collapse of companies, such as Enron. This was the first sign that we were heading towards some serious problems, was the collapse of Enron, when deregulation helped them to illegally misrepresent their companies to investors, to lie about how much it was actually worth. The Enron collapse in 2001 should have been an early warning sign that the American economy was headed towards serious problems because of deregulation. In 2008, our banking crisis would be the result of our failure to learn from the mistakes that led to Enron. Despite this, however, in 2004, George W. Bush wins re-election. This was again one of our closest elections in history. And again, it came down to the results in just one state. This time, that state was Ohio. Now, this election was a victory for Bush. It was a clear victory for Bush. Bush defeated his opponent, John Kerry, both in electoral and popular votes, even though the election itself was a very narrow one. Bush won Ohio by about 120,000 votes and pulled off the national popular victory as well. So conservatives continued their winning streak of controlling our national government. Thank you. That is all for today. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.